Hello, I'm Stephen Nucci, the outgoing communications officer of Overlake Composite Squadron in Redmond, Washington. And we've been a very rapidly growing, cadet-heavy, and emergency services ambitious squadron. So I've done a lot of ICUTs in the last couple of years. And my squadron leadership asked me to prepare for you prepare for my replacement some documentation about how I have come to believe the ICUT skill evaluation should be done. So that's the purpose of this video, and my intention is to make it suitable for wider distribution. So it's a message in a bottle, and perhaps a valuable training resource. So we are this is being recorded during the COVID pandemic in early September 2020. The Motorola radio program rollout program has not yet reached us, so we're still working with E.F. Johnson's. Some details in this may have to be adjusted a little bit, but I don't think it's going to change radically unless they come out with a completely new skill evaluation worksheet, rubric, or guidance on how to do it, which I don't think is in the immediate plans. So, without further ado, I'll say that I am going to suggest some deviations, slight deviations in emphasis and mainly in scope from the official recommendation. So we're going to begin by looking at those regulations, the regulatory background of the ICUT and the ICUT skill evaluation in particular. I'm going to assume here that your students have, in fact, completed all of the online video training and the written tests, online written tests that go with that. If that is not the case, then I'll show you where that leads you. And I will also say that I have found that if the student has not completed it recently, the evaluation is kind of rough. So take that into account. Try to be timely. Make yourself available on a regular basis, a predictable basis. And you'll have to get aggressive probably with your squadron cadet leadership to get the cadets who need to be evaluated to focus on that and dedicate time to it, get time away from often their cadre. And they are very busy during meeting times. So it's incumbent on the communication officer to communicate to both the ICUT students and their leadership that time needs to be made available for this. And we'll go into why here. So that's the welcome. We're going to segue into regulations. I'll talk a little bit about why I do it the way I do it, how I think about it. And then we'll review what you need to do before you do the evaluation. Then we'll go through the evaluation score sheet and item by item and talk about content and approach scoring for each of those things. And then what you do at the conclusion and to follow up. CAP R 100-1 is our guiding document. And so this is the section 5.2 that talks about the ICUT, and it doesn't really say a whole lot about how the evaluation is to be done. It refers you to section 5.2.5 is where it talks about the evaluation and the instructor guide. Now it refers to an instructor guide being on e-services, communication section of e-services, following the instructor's guide found. Now, the document called Instructor's Guide on e-services right now is just the appendix, which fortunately is exactly the official regulation on how to conduct the skills evaluation. The rest of the document can be found on, I believe it's North Carolina Wing, I believe, has a copy of it that's current. And what that does is, here, if you have to administer the training and testing before the skills evaluation, then that document is your Bible for that. It's not actually on the National Communication site. If we go to e-services, down here at the bottom, communications, library, training material, you'll see ICUT evaluation form and evaluator's guide. So 100-1 refers you to the training guide, of which the evaluator's guide is an appendix. And that in turn refers you to the evaluation form. So this form is in fact part of the standard for administering the ICUT skills evaluation. So if you develop your own form, it needs to be compatible. The regulation doesn't technically give you permission to develop your own form. And I don't think you really need to. The form that they give you is adequate to the task. So here is the evaluation worksheet, or what I think many would call a rubric, which is, a grade sheet. It's got space for a name. And I'll say right now that you should also have, you should write down their CAP ID number and their name in that little blank. Because when we get to the end, you're going to have to go into their e-services communications qualifications page, and getting to it with their CAP ID and then verifying that the name is right will help avoid errors. I've seen more than once the wrong person getting credit. And then this is the evaluation guide. The evaluator will have each student complete the full evaluation, allow any student to watch the evaluation of another, prompt a student who fails a demonstration to demonstrate an action correctly, but only a few times during the evaluation. That's kind of vague, but we'll go over, again, what I've learned about how students handle each of the questions, each of the tasks, and my suggestions for how to prompt and score their responses. And again, here it says specifically use the form provided. Required equipment, again, by regulation right now, it just says either the mobile or the handheld E.F. Johnson. If you've got the Motorola's, you'll have to adapt the instructions slightly. And then it goes through step by step what you're required to do, which will do my version of this, which again is slightly expanded in scope, and I'll talk about why. Anyway, this is the written specification. And then ICUT appears on your 101 card at the end. All right, so where am I in my plan? So that's the regulatory overview. Let's talk about the you should have taken the skills evaluator training, SET, and be qualified as an SET. You should have the rubric. Go back to my 101 card. It shows the diamond for skills evaluator. Your 101 card should show that. If it does, and you have a communications primary or secondary role in the squadron, then you should be able to, then you're qualified to do the skill evaluation, and also will have permission in these services to record the results. And that would include actually cadet, qualified cadet who have been given a communications job role in e-services. Okay. So let's talk about the philosophy of the ICUT. We have two big things going on here. First of all, we have an obligation to our military sponsoring agencies to ensure that the frequencies, the spectrum that we're assigned and the equipment that we're assigned is used correctly by qualified personnel and according to the rules and regulations set out. And so requiring the ICUT for all CAP radio operators is a part of that, and so it's incumbent on us to administer the skills evaluation and the rest of the testing for training and testing for the ICUT in a standardized way, as your SAT training emphasized, and in accordance with the regulations, and to be sure that we accomplish the goals of each of both the ICUT and the subsequent communications qualifications, that there's actually a learning going on, and that the student leaves this with the requisite level of understanding and capability. That's one thing, is our responsibility to the Air Force and to the airwaves in general, as well as confidentiality of information and all the other things that we want them to learn from a regulatory point of view. On the other hand, and I think this is critical to understanding your role as an ICUT evaluator. On the other hand, this is the first skills evaluation most members, senior or cadet, will have. It's also the gateway to almost everything on the 101 card, all the ES qualifications. It's a gateway to being staff or cadre at encampments. And so it's important that we get them over this hump. It's going to begin their journey in many ways. So I want to emphasize that the goal is not to fail them. The goal is to get them to pass responsibly. I've only had to fail, I believe, 2 students out of dozens and dozens that I've done. Usually because they had taken the online training too far in the past and had forgotten more stuff than I could gloss over. So I'm going to zoom into this. As I said, we're going to put the name and CAP ID here. You need both so that you can enter it into e-services when you're done. Now this form includes check boxes for both radios. You're only required to use one for any given student. And then we have, I think of these as basically a checklist, and the actual wording in the box is just a reminder to you, the evaluator, of what steps you need to take. And I want to go through here item by item and talk about what they're for, what we look for, and what problems to expect as the student goes through it. Okay, so we talked about philosophy. We've got the rubric sitting here. Let's go back to talk about preparation. All right. You should prepare yourself first. I recommend, before you begin administering ICUT skills evaluations, that you go back through the video training that your students will have taken, and if possible, retake those tests to remind yourself what they're up against, and also read the relevant regulation, the entire instructor's manual, not just that appendix, right? Not just the evaluation guide, but the whole document that this is part of. And refamiliarize yourself with the radio. And if possible, practice with another senior member before you begin doing this with cadets. But, so here's the rubric. Let's go through it step by step. Let's begin with the setting and the setup for this. So you've prepared yourself. Now you need to prepare your materials, your workspace, and think about how this is going to be organized. You should schedule the evaluation, particularly with cadets, allowing 15 to 20 minutes per cadet. Because of cadet protection issues, you need to have at least 2 cadets, or you need a senior member escort if you're doing this in a closed space. Whether it's a fixed base radio room, or in our case, almost all of our ICUT evaluations have been done using the mobile radio in our van, our squadron van. And that's, of course, a space that's closed off from the rest of the squadron activities. We generally do it in the middle of our weekly squadron meeting, although other arrangements can be made. But usually I do it with 3 or 4 cadets. And the way I do it, it ends up taking 15 minutes per cadet. Sometimes a little bit more for the first one, but as we saw in the actual the actual requirements for this, we can allow students to watch each other, and so the subsequent students generally go a little bit faster. So one thing that I do, again, I mentioned we do this in our squadron van, and our meeting night happens to overlap with the weekly VHF net for our home repeater. And so what I like to do when possible is schedule the evaluation to be right after the net, and to have the students join me at the beginning of the net. And I go through our weekly check-in. They get to listen to a directed net live. That experience, I don't know that I can say that I have evidence to support my sense that that's a good practice. It's something I've done. I like doing it. It does extend the amount of time that they have to dedicate to the process. And again, I can't say that I can really document that it's helpful. So I'll just leave that there to document what I've done. So the radio that you use for the evaluation needs to be functional. In particular, all the user interface features, the channel readout, the channel control buttons, all the buttons need to work. The display needs to work. It's not really a requirement that the radio itself work, so you're not going to need to transmit. If it has a remote antenna, the student's not going to check that, so it doesn't even really need that, but it does need an antenna cable to satisfy the requirements. If it's a handheld, I like to use I have a personally owned E.F. Johnson handheld, and I have the hand mic that goes with that. So we can map all the requirements for the radios, for the mobile radio can be mapped onto the handheld. And I've done that at squadron volunteer events where I had a large number of cadets with varying amounts of time throughout the day, and I ran several of them through it at those outdoor festivals where we were doing traffic control and that sort of thing. So using a handheld, I have used the handheld. But without the hand mic, you have to skip a step, and I'd rather not skip a step if it can be avoided. Okay, what else do you need? So you should have prepared yourself. You should have the rubric or score sheet. So I also like to have there's a list in 100-1 of 10 prohibited practices. And so I like to print that out because you're going to need it. Print it out on the back of the score sheet when you prepare your forms set. If you set it up so you print that on the back of it. And also prepare some messages, some written, shortish, 1 sentence, 2 sentences, 15, 20 words, tactical radio messages. And what I like to use is local, difficult local names. Like names of lakes or roads or towns or military facilities or something like that. Use some of those names that are difficult to, that have a lot of letters in them. Let's just say a lot of the less common letters. Like there's a rhododendron park in our area, or there's a dam with a long name. There are a lot of Indian place names. So use some of those names in some of your messages. Set up have several messages. If you're going to do up to 4 cadets at a time, you should probably have 4 messages prepared. We'll talk about what I like to do with those. every message should have at least one, typically one, sometimes two portions of it that have a moderately challenging word that you might typically go with I spell or figures when you're sending the message. And then I underline that section, that word or group of figures or whatever it is going to be. And in my briefing, I tell them that they're to spell that out phonetically. Now, I'll have more to say about that in a bit. And I'll emphasize again, prepare yourself mentally before you begin the process. If you're doing these every week, you're probably okay. But for your first one, or if you haven't done it in a long time, spend some time prepping for this. So let's look over the issues here. So check or describe check power, antenna, and mic. So this doesn't say in microphone, but our typical radios have up to 3 detachable points, and they all need to be there. So what's the point of this item? The point of this item is to make sure that the student has at least an awareness that these things can be detached, and that in the case of the antenna connection, you can damage the equipment if it's operated with it detached. So what I'm looking for is an awareness that you need power, antenna, and a microphone if it's detachable. And so in the case of the handheld, you typically have a removable battery pack, and often the antenna is removable. So we can actually do all these steps on both. Again, I like to have my handheld mic for my hand mic for my handheld radio, so we can do all the steps on both radios. We'll get to actually removing it in a minute. We'll talk about that. So this goes pretty quickly. What I look for here, I want the student to put their fingers on the various pieces and know which is which. I'll give them some coaching on it, particularly, how do you know that that's power? How do you know that that's the antenna? And we're looking for the big silver connector, or whatever. And I'll either tell them or prompt them to tell me why it's important that we check these things. Okay, so this is a quick item. It's not instant, but it's quick. And the standard is basically I want them to leave with an awareness that things might be detached and that they can reattach them before they operate the radio. It's not a big deal, but that's the teaching goal there. Second item, turn on the radio. Very simple. They may fumble for the control, but it's quick and easy. Adjust the volume. Again, it's the same control on both radios as on off. It doesn't take but a second. Since you typically don't have any traffic or content on there, it's kind of a mime action. But again, we want to get them over the fright, whatever hesitancy they might have to actually operate the controls. And again, we want them to have put their fingers on the control and know that it's there and that it controls the volume. So now, change the channel. At least 2 different zone and channel combinations. Again, this is zone and channel is the E.F. Johnson terminology. So I use this as a teaching opportunity. I want my students to be aware, at ICUT level, just awareness of the fact that there are documents available to them. If they have a VHF radio, then they should have a station logbook. In our van, it's the back section of the van logbook. For fixed radios, it should be a binder near it. And in that logbook, I make sure that we have the current version of the call sign table for the wing and the channel guide for the wing's code plug. All right, and then the teaching that goes on here is beyond like awareness of the fact that the channel guide is there. I try to get them to go through the process of taking a CAP channel name and finding it in the channel guide, going over to the E.F. Johnson column, figuring out which zone and channel is involved, and then operating the controls to find the corresponding zone and channel. Now this item can take a little while because the controls on both the mobile and the handheld are not obvious. And require a little learning on the part of the student to get there, and also then there's the abstract thinking involved in identifying, in understanding the mapping from a channel name to the appropriate zone and channel, and then getting that programmed into the radio. That's quite a lot of muscle memory and cognitive activity to be going through. The take home that I'm looking for here is, again, just an awareness for the ICUT user, just an awareness that these documents exist, and that an awareness that we use channel names, and that there's a mapping, and that they can look it up, and that in particular, if we're talking to an aircraft or what have you, that their radio doesn't have the same mapping. The Motorola's won't have the same mapping from channel name to zone and channel. And so I want them to be aware that, that we don't want to communicate what channel to use or to move a conversation to in terms of zone and channel. Not primarily in those terms, but if the person you're talking to has a handheld and no book with them, they may need to be told what zone and channel that we want them to move to. So these are pretty subtle issues. Again, my teaching goal here is simply that they are aware of, A, that if they're using a radio, they should have these documents available to them, and B, an awareness that there are multiple nomenclatures floating around, and that we need to be careful or seek clarification if we're communicating about a channel to another operator. All right, and so our home repeater is how our van radio is normally set, and so I would pick another repeater, typically the nearest one, which is sometimes in range, depending on weather. And I'd have them look up the corresponding zone and channel and switch the radio to that, and then switch back typically for the two changes. Sometimes we'll switch to one of the the simplex frequencies, but that gets them through this exercise. Oh, and one thing I slip in here is we're using Romeo 11, Romeo 11 that's our home repeater, and at some point I'll ask them, do they know what the Romeo is for? And so that gives us a chance to talk about repeaters and how repeaters operate, and just for awareness of the fact that there is a repeater involved, what a repeater does. All right, so adjust high-low power. These next several items are just about, again, the teaching goal here is basically that if the radio is set incorrectly, we want the student to have gone through the process of setting it back, or verifying a setting. So on the E.F. Johnson, particularly on actually both, if you want to, say, if you want to verify that you're on high power, say, you have to press the high-low button. And when you do that, the display shows you momentarily low power. Well, that meant that you were on high power. So you press it again to go back to high power, and it displays it, and that's your verification. So these toggling switches are something that the goal here is to get the student familiar with and comfortable with the fact that if the radio is misconfigured or they want to verify the configuration, they press the button. If they press the wrong button, they can just press it again. That's the whole goal of this whole section. Again, they should not be using scan, so they need to know how to turn it off if it gets turned on. Okay, set squelch select. This is both a toggle button that they should know how to put. They should know which mode is normal, and this is an opportunity to basically introduce them to, or remind them what the squelch function is, and to basically just convey to them that select is what they're going to be using if they're using a VHF radio in normal CAP operation, and that if circumstances warrant it for whatever reason, the button's there and they can switch it off. And so this says instructor demo for the other buttons, key select, etc. These are all, on the mobile, these are pretty easy because they're just like the other buttons, on, off. On the handheld, there's one button that leads to a menu and you have to press a different button to get out of it. So that's one exception to the on-off, push on, push off rule. I've found that demonstrating this is a little loosey-goosey. It gets a little repetitive to go through all these button pushes. But overall, this section goes very quickly. Students don't have a problem with it with a little bit of prompting. And the teaching goal is really just that they understand that they can push the buttons, they can verify a setting, and I would like for them to retain some memory of what the normal settings of the radio should be. Then turn off the radio, again, that's instant. I note that the form has these backwards. When the radio is on for the first section and off for the rest. Connect the microphone. Okay, again, for the F. Johnsons, both the handheld and the mobile, if you have the hand mic for the handheld, there's a fiddly process of getting these connectors off and back on. And so the first thing I do when I get to this item is I tell them, okay, look, if you're using any force at all, you're doing it wrong. I'm very concerned if we have 100 cadets, literally, go through this process and every one of them removes and replaces that microphone plug. It's a lot of wear on that plug, and if they grab it and it doesn't move and they yank harder, that plug is going to fail, and we don't want that. So the first thing I do is I tell them, look, when you find the combination for this, and it is a combination, it's a finger skill. When you find the combination for this, there will be no force involved. Do not force this. Usually with that coaching, they'll put their hand on it and start trying to figure out the combination. And particularly for removing the mobile microphone, some students get it right away, but many of them really struggle with what you have to do is basically, and you'll know this, but basically you have to roll your fingers to pull that retaining ring back. And then you remove it by the retaining ring. And then when you replace it, if you try to push the retaining ring, the reverse of the operation, that doesn't work. You've got to push the body. So you can't pull the body out and you can't push the ring in. Just conveying to them what that is without actually doing it for them. We spend a few seconds here just trying to convey, using words, what that motion is. Once the students found the combination, they're done. They understand it. They can do it any time. But as the communications officer, I'm very concerned about the safety of my equipment in this stage, because I've seen some cadets yank pretty hard on that cord. So just I would suggest a pre-briefing on that. You might consider demonstrating once, as right after you get in the radio, before you begin the evaluation, demonstrating that process to them, pre-emphasizing to not use any force. Anyway, just something to be very aware of, particularly if you're going to be doing a large number of these over a period of time. So demonstrate holding the microphone. So I just asked the students, show me what it looks like, or show me how you would hold the microphone if you're going to send a message. And what I'm looking for here is that they have it pointed at their mouth, somewhere near their mouth, and if the student puts it right in front of their face, I will tell them that they don't have to have it right in front of their mouth. It has to be pointed at their mouth, and so you can hold it to the side a little bit. You get that plosive boom if you speak right into the microphone like that. And so I try to, if a student is very aggressive about putting it right in front of their face, I'll try to coach them to move it to the side a little bit, but keep it aimed at their mouth. But other than that, this is pretty easy. They just, I want to see a finger or a thumb on the push to talk switch, and it held in front of their face near enough that it'll work, and aimed more or less with the microphone part aimed more or less at their mouth. Pretty simple. This has the secondary effect of beginning the process of getting the shy students over their mic fright. If they pantomime once, and then we'll do the message next. Okay, so the next step, this is the one that takes probably the most time. And this is where I begin to deviate a little bit in my approach from the written sequence here. All right, so send a normal tactical message successfully. Okay, we're not going to actually send it. We're gonna mime that. So the radio is actually off at this stage. So what I do is I hand them one of the message cards. I say, so what do you? So here's my dialogue at this point. So what do you need to do before you send a message? So they've already done the pantomime of holding the microphone. Now I want them to prepare to send a message. So there are three things I'm looking for an operator to do before they send a message. Number one is think. And this can be expressed in many different ways, but the first thing I want them to do is to know what they're, is to think about what they're about to do. Prepare. Read the message, know how you're going to send it, etc. The second thing is listen, right? You want to send on a clear channel. You make sure it's your turn to talk. So I'm looking for some variation on think, some variation on listen, and then the last thing is the mechanical skill. And again, I coach the student through these. I prompt them for them. But I'm looking for an understanding of all three of these. The third thing is the technical habit of keying, pausing before you speak, between the key up and speaking. And so my suggestion to them at this stage, again, a little bit of teaching worked into it, is that you key as you're breathing in to begin the message. Something to get them in the habit of mind. I'm trying to begin forming a habit of mind of leaving enough time, of not beginning to speak as you're keying. CAP 3740, no, I want the mic button pushed, pause, and then speak. Okay. So the skill item here is send an informal tactical message successfully. Okay. Now let's talk about these message cards that I've prepared. Again, I've chosen challenging words usually, or sometimes figure groups from our local area and built messages around them, like CAP aircraft such and such. Overfly this, difficult to pronounce dam, and report conditions, like as you might do in a post-disaster survey situation. Typical message, right? And because we're not actually going to do a two-way traffic, it needs to be suitable for one-way transmission. And so I asked them to review that. Now, what I've done is typically I've put a characterization of the sender and recipient. So I say, as mission base, tell aircraft such and such to go overfly the dam. And what I've asked the students to do is to figure out how they would actually map that to call signs. And then at this point, I introduce them to the call sign guide in the book. This might be a bridge too far. I think in the future I may just go ahead and explicitly give them the to and from call signs, because it's just a little bit too much cognitive load for the beginners at that stage. It's an important call sign. The skill of figuring out what call sign to use is an important one. But what I think will do instead with ICUT students, and I've always incorporated this in my coaching anyway, is tell them if they're using a CAP radio, they should know what the call signs are. They should be part of their briefing for using the radio as an ICUT user. So anyway, so that's has been my practice to date to ask them as part of the think stage of sending the message, to ask them to determine what the call signs should be for that message. But I think I'm going to redo that and give them explicitly call signs. It has simply been a bridge too far for too many of the students. So what I'm looking for then is that they think, either tell me that they've listened. I like it if they'll tell me that, okay, now I'm going to listen, and the radio's off, nothing's going to happen there, but they should understand the steps. And then I look for a tangible pause between the key down and the beginning of speak. And the main thing we're looking for here is proper use of pro words. And also integrated into this is proper use of the phonetic alphabet. So I'm going to have them spell a 20 letter word. It doesn't have the whole alphabet in it, but I'm looking for fluidity and not an excessive number of either prompts or fumbling incidents in the phonetic part. I'm looking for crisp use of the common pro words. They don't necessarily need to say, call sign, this is call sign, but I'd like to hear that. I'd like to hear I spell at the beginning of the spelling. I really want to hear over at the end of it. I really want to hear that. And most students get through this pretty easily. I think they know, they're aware that the radio is off, so there's not a lot of mic fright. As an exercise, it does, I guess, help alleviate mic fright. The biggest thing that helps alleviate mic fright, though, is using the ISRs in squadron level or team level activities, flight level activities. But anyway. So this is kind of the core of the whole thing. I don't want to spend not much more to say about it, but we accomplished quite a few of our goals right here. The next item, who will the message go to? So at this point, they have sent the message, and I've given them their feedback on their performance. Often I have to remind them about pro words that they didn't use or used incorrectly. So this is who will the message go to? And the subtext here is importance of delivery. I think that's more of an MRO skill. But who will the message go to I use this as a prompt to actually get to this item, the define tactical call signs item, and functional designators. So this is not, at this point, they've just sent the message, and we're going to talk about the call signs in the header of the message. And so whether it was a functional designator or a tactical call sign in the to position of the header, it gives us a lead into this item. So I actually do this item out of order. I pull this up right here. So who will the message go to? What kind of call sign is that? What's the other kind of call sign? How do they differ? Where do they come from? So this is a combination of question, knowledge test, prompting, coaching, and teaching. Because the teaching goal here is to understand that we're only allowed to use two kinds of call signs. One of them comes from the Air Force, is delegated to us by the Air Force, and is attached to the station or the generally the station. Long-term. It's a long-term association. And the other kind is the functional designator is assigned by the CUL, whoever's running the comm shop for the operation, and it's temporary. And one of the things that I say is you can even have more than one functional designator in the course of a day. You might be on a ground team in the morning and sent out to parking lot patrol in the afternoon. Those would be two different functional designators. So I think that helps. So these three items taken together, send the message, really four items: demonstrate holding the microphone, send the message, discuss the call signs involved in that message, That's all one big unit in the process. And then we're in the home stretch. So this item says, when are Mayday, Securite, and Pan used? And let me tell you, we get a wide range of responses on this. And people's understanding of the Securite and Pan is as loosey-goosey as you might expect it to be, given that they're basically never used in reality. So again, this says when. What I'm looking for is an understanding, and most students do okay on understanding that Mayday is for legit emergencies, and then the other two are for something else. So there's prompting here or teaching. And I like to use some examples. So our squadron has a high mountain, well, moderately high mountain pass between us and one of the main training sites for the wing. And so a lot of my examples for this involve van loads of cadets crossing the pass in winter. Okay. I think everybody understands Mayday is life and limb. Okay, but the difference between Securite and Pan, I'll say, like, so one of the examples I use is, let's say we got a van load going over the mountains and we go off the road into a snowdrift. Well, if nobody's injured, everybody's got their sleeping bags, and we've got water, that's Pan. If we've got an injury, we don't have sleeping bags, or etc., or we're teetering on the brink of a cliff, that might be a Mayday. Okay, Securite then, again, in the van analogy, if we're out and we come across, out in an actual emergency, we come across a bridge that's washed out, say. Well, if we stop and turn around, that bridge out is not a danger to us. It's not Mayday or even Pan. But we want the rest of everybody out there. We want the rest of the net to be aware of the hazard. That's Securite. Another example of you're in a camp and there's a bear on the other side of the valley. That sounds like Securite. There's a bear on your side of the valley, is Pan. There's a bear in your food bin. That's Mayday. So anyway, just little examples to get them thinking about it. But when they're used is only part of the equation. I want my operators to know how to use these. So the next question I say is, and again, this is an expansion of the scope, but I think it's important. How do you use these? And I'm looking for 3, right? You say the word 3 times. And we talk about the fact that you basically send a broadcast transmission. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is call sign. Nature of emergency. Assistance needed. Over. Right? So I'm looking for that 3. It's an international standard. They should be aware of it as radio operators. And then that's probably enough there. Some students are really interested in this, some are less so. So we might get a little more discussion. Again, if you've got 3 or 4 students in the van with you or in the Radio Shack with you, this might be a kind of a lengthy discussion with the first one, but it should go pretty quickly with the rest. So I cover when the urgency pro words are used and how they are used with pretty much every student. If things are going well, I also bring up, what do you do when you hear an emergency radio message? What I'm looking for here is, well, of course, pay attention. I suggest that they make a log entry or otherwise write down what they've heard. It's the sort of thing that could end up being important in a subsequent investigation or court hearing, or even in locating people. Most importantly, cease using that channel for non-emergency traffic. Stand by to help if needed or possible, if you're able. It's very unlikely that an ICUT operator will be the station best positioned to forward emergency traffic, but it could happen, and so I'd like for my students to have thought it through and at least have had an exposure to what they need to do. Clear the net, log the traffic, stand by to help if needed. So like I said, I don't end up covering that with every student, but it's on my list. All right, give at least 2 of the 10 prohibited practices. This is kind of a trick question because a lot of students come up with things that are bad ideas, and they're pretty good at coming up with bad ideas that violate recommendations or even are actually prohibited in the regulations but not as part of the official list of 10 prohibited practices. I tend to be pretty lax about that if they can come up with different ones, and so I actually print the list of 10 on the back of the worksheet, and I tell them they're going to have to come up with, each student in turn has to come up with 2 of these practices that have not already been given by the other students. So it gets progressively more challenging. I give progressively more slack. And I tend to count as right if they come up with a good example that's not technically one of the 10. Most of them understand that profanity isn't allowed. Most of them get some variation on tuning and testing or excessive power or something like that. The OPSEC issues they tend to be less aware of, and so that's a good teaching opportunity to remind them of the OPSEC requirements and rules. But we generally stumble through that one. I haven't failed anybody for that one. We've already covered the call signs, and so that leaves us with directed nets and free nets. With the exception of one ex-military and ham licensed senior member, I don't think anybody's gotten this one right without a lot of prompting. Even, and this is where I say I don't know that I'm doing the right thing, even if we sat through the squadron or the wing VHF net at the beginning of the session, I don't know what the deal is there. I really don't. But and I actually went back. This is one of the times I went back and reviewed the videos. Video does a pretty good job of explaining this. It just doesn't sink in. They don't retain it. They don't retain what a directed net is and how it's distinguished from a free net after watching the videos. They don't. So you're going to have to coach them through this one. That's just, if we're going to pass them, we've got to do this. Now, passing scores. Let's talk about that for a second. I have a recollection of being told or seeing in print. It's kind of vague, but I have a recollection that they could miss up to 2 of these things and still pass the whole thing. As I was reviewing the regulations for doing this video, I did not find that. I don't think that that's actually a rule. So they need to do a satisfactory job on most of this. And what I've done is if I have to mark 2 items as being fails, in other words, they can't do it, they weren't able to demonstrate the skill or knowledge, even with a suitable level of coaching or prompting, then I mark the item as a fail. And if there are 2 fails on the worksheet, then I'm going to probably tell them to do it over. And really, that's rare that you can't coach them through it. So we've reached the end of the rubric. At this point, we go into the conclusion. And again, this is SET spells out that you should tell the student right away if they passed or failed. And if they, there will usually be follow-up items. In particular, it's very rare for them to get the phonetic to be strong on the phonetic alphabet. And so a very common piece of follow-up guidance that I give is to practice the phonetic alphabet in daily life, in idle moments. So a couple of examples, reading license plates as you're driving or riding around in the car. Read those phonetically, that's good practice. Also, like candy wrappers, read all the ingredients phonetically. A couple of examples. I don't know if anybody's actually followed up on that advice, but I do try to give that. So the other group of people who have trouble with the phonetic alphabet is COPs, because they have their own phonetic code, and so they're senior members. So I just give them you need to practice this. But the same basic advice, find difficult text somewhere and practice reading it using the CAP, military standard, Air Force standard phonetic alphabet. So at that point, before you release the student, keep in mind that this is the first thing they've got on their one-on-one card almost every case. And so this is a teaching moment to tell them about the one-on-one card, what it's for, that they now have one, and and I tell them that at the end of the session I will go to my laptop and enter their qualification, and at that point they should print their one-on-one card, their first one-on-one card. Which brings us to the follow-up. At the end of all this, we as the evaluator need to go into eServices using the name and CAP ID that we captured at the beginning of this, and the pass versus fail outcome, and go into eServices. Now, like everything else in eServices, there is a path to get to this. When you go to enter your students' scores, or really what you're entering is the fact that on a certain date they've passed the element. It's under operations. So like everything else involving communications, it's got its own little section. Operations, operations qualifications, and then up here to the drop down and scroll down to communications qualification entry. So we don't use the pedestrians SQTR grid. We've got our own. Enter the CAP ID. Verify that the name matches. And then what you should see is that they've passed the written tests and that they're missing the skills evaluations. And at that point, you just put your CAP ID in each of these squares, and you fill in the date, and then save. There'll be a save button that lights up when you've entered new data. So you need to put the date that was completed and your CAP ID into both of these squares, and you'll have to fiddle. If you haven't done this before, you'll end up fiddling with it a little bit and get the flow down. It's a little bit creaky, but it works. Now, if you have actually administered like a written test as part of the training, then you'll enter all of this. But usually it's just these two fields, and everything else is already active or already checked off. And then you hit save, and then it should show their ICUT is active as soon as you do that. You need to verify that it's gone through, and if you do find that say the written or the online testing isn't complete, then you should reach out to the student and communicate that to them. I think I want my students to be eager and successful in getting a one-on-one card with an actual qual on it out of this process quickly. And so when I do find that something isn't kosher, then I want to reach out to the student and let them know right away and try to help them through the process. So this has been my message in a bottle about how I like to conduct the ICUT evaluations. I hope you find this helpful and that your students become skilled and comfortable communicators. Thank you.